Welcome to Foreign Countries, Conversations in Archaeology with me, Ash Lenton. And welcome to a whole new season on the archaeology of later prehistoric Europe. This episode is about Bronze Age states in southern Spain and in Crete. In a short while I'll be talking to Jan Driessen about his work at Minoan CC. But I'm joined first by Dr. Roberto Risch of the Autonomous University of Barcelona and La Proyecto Bastida. Roberto and his colleagues recently published a paper in Antiquity on the emblems and spaces of power during the Archaic Bronze Age in southeastern Spain. So welcome, Roberto. Your research is about a period of dramatic change in the European Bronze Age. Can you tell me about the background to your team's research and what questions you aim to answer?
What our team and myself are trying to do is to understand what happened in the Bronze Age Europe. So that's the time between 2200 BC and the War of Troy, more or less about 1,000 years. And we have always seen that there are great states in Egypt and Mesopotamia at that time, the second millennium basically. And we thought that Europe was, well, maybe in some regions there were some type of chieftain, small-scale political and economical groups. Nothing very complex, and especially nothing like the states in the East. In the 19th century, surprisingly, the picture was slightly different. There were two Belgian engineers, Henri and Louis Siré, which came to Almeria, Murcia, southeast Iberia, the most arid part of Iberia, and started to excavate about more than a dozen sites of the Bronze Age, especially, and they found more than 1,600 burials. And some of these burials were extremely rich, not only male grave with swords and daggers and halberds, but also female burials, which some of them had these diadems, these silver diadems. And they also excavated the settlements. They published more about the tombs, less about the settlement. And they saw that this was a very large-scale economic political system. They had this feeling they were scientists. They excavated rather well for their time. And they had a view that this was something different, that was not fitting very well in what was known on the Bronze Age. Unfortunately, this work was not continued, partly because of the Spanish Civil War, 40 years of dictatorship, etc., etc. And after, in the 80s, new teams started to work, also in the 70s, on sites, but we always did small-scale excavations. In La Bastida and La Almoloya, which are the two sites we have been excavating over the last 10 to 13 years, we have had the possibility to excavate in large scale, which means to uncover maybe 2,000 square meters. That's large for Spain, it's small for Egypt maybe, but this was not usual in Europe. And this opening, making large extensive surfaces has shown us an architecture and has shown us burials which resemble not only those found in the 19th century, but which give a totally new view on the Bronze Age in southeast Iberia.
And you are finding similarities to the Unetice areas in central Germany.
After the fall of the Iron Curtain, large infrastructure projects started, and the state services of heritage started also to excavate hectares. They opened hectares and hectares and found settlements, burials of an extraordinary Bronze Age society, which is called the Aunetice society. In southeast Iberia, we speak about El Argar. And in Central Europe, we speak about Aunetice. And also in Aunetice, there are burials with halberds and with swords and with elites, with gold, not with silver. That's a difference. And so our interest is, well, maybe the Bronze Age was not just simple chiefdoms, and we have a complex political relationship, and maybe there are interconnections which we were not looking at so far. So I think that's the main question, is how was the political organization of some societies, not of all, but in certain parts of Europe, how was the political organization of this?
Okay, so in terms of applying modern methodology, how do you go about comparing the El Algar to the Unetice sites?
On three large levels, we are doing comparisons at the moment. One is definitely on settlement archaeology. We knew quite a lot about burials. In the 20th century, A lot of burials in Europe were excavated, in Iberia also, and in Central Europe. And we had information on the burials, and there were some very rich burials with gold, silver, weapons, nice ornaments. And these catch the eye of the scientists and of the general public. But much less was, or practically nothing was known about the settlements, because that implied much more resources, much more time than just digging up burials. And this is one important thing. We need to understand the settlements. The settlement is one very, very important aspect to understand how the people are living and how their economy was organized, what social differences existed, not in the burials, but in the living population. In the case of El Argar, this has shown us that in La Almoyoya specifically, we have good arguments to think that there was a palace standing in the late El Argar time. So that we would be talking about the 17th century BC, more or less between 1700 and 1550 BC. That would be the time where El Argar was in its maximum expansion territorially and politically. And this is the time when we have stated the hypothesis that that is a state society.
And what do you mean by a state society?
For us, there are many definitions of state, but for us, the main thing is that you have an elite which is extracting surplus through taxes. This is done mainly in El Argar and also in Aunjetits in form of cereal. So these taxes, these cereal, are passed to an elite, but this elite doesn't use it like in a chiefdom only for themselves, but redistributes it. There is a circulation of surplus value for producing handcraft, for the military, for the armies, to finance expansionist expedition, which we know existed. So there is a whole mechanism of changing value, of accumulating, so that for the general population, it becomes unclear what is happening to my taxes, which is a typical state thing. Some people win, and those who lose often don't know why are we losing. Look, for example, in our own time at the banking system, you put your money there and then something has happened and you don't know what was it. No, so let's say El Argar and Aunjetits, we think, are the first tax offices in Europe which existed at that time.
All right, so how do you approach economy?
There is a category of tools which has been largely underestimated and not studied in sufficient detail. And this is what in English you say the groundstone tools. These are large tools ranging from grinding stones to abraders, hammerstones, anvils for metalworking, metal hammers. For example, in El Argar, we have found a specific tool with which they separated the bees' wax from the bees' honey. It's a special tool, a long schist, which was heated, and thanks to residue analysis, we found out this is a tool with which they produced honey and they could separate it, the wax, which is very important, for example, for illumination or for conservation. So now, having identified these tools, we can say in the settlements, where are the people producing honey? How much are they producing? To which other settlements don't have these tools? So we're dependent, if they wanted honey, on the other settlements. So there is both in central Germany and in southeast Spain, there are several PhD and postdocs working on groundstone material to understand what were people doing, how much were they producing, and what was the specialization, the economic specialization, was every house having one grinding stone and one toolkit, or was there specialization?
And what is it you're starting to see?
What we see is that in southeast Spain, we have workshops with hundreds of tools, of different tools, also with loom weights where they were producing textiles. We have other rooms where were storage, cereal storage. As I was saying, the text was in form of cereal. So if you would be excavating in Turkey or in the Near East in general, you would have no doubt that this is a palace. You would, any archaeologist would interpret that as a palace. But as we are in Western Mediterranean, people say, oh, no, it can't be possible. It's impossible. The states are only in the bad guys are in the East. We in Europe were happy people in the Bronze Age and we're nice people, you know. No. Unfortunately, the picture is much more complex.
And then there are the burials.
And then the third level, of course, is the funerary evidence. And the funerary evidence now we are doing systematically genetic analysis on the ancient DNA, which we extract from the pars petrosa of the skulls. And this is working very well. We have about 60% success rate in this. So from every 10, we get 6 burials where we have the DNA. And the DNA shows us the relations. One, this will be published very, very shortly. How was El Argar formed as a society? Which populations came together in Southeast Iberia to form? In Central Europe, we know the Central Europe Bronze Age, the Aunjetitze, is a mixture of bell beaker communities and so-called corded ware communities. And these two communities, which both have their ancestry in Eastern Europe, they intermingled, came together, stopped producing their funny pottery, which is called the bell beaker and the corded ware, suddenly stopped. All the pottery was undecorated, and that is the typical Aunjetitz pottery.
And how is that comparable to El Algar?
The typical pottery of El Algar is also undecorated. We have the bell beaker period before. We have symbolic Los Millares. This is a Spanish Copper Age culture called Los Millares. We have Los Millares decorated bowls. And suddenly, at 2200, there's no more Los Millares, no more bell beaker pottery. And we have a new type, which and now we see also genetically, it's the coming together of 2 or even 3 types of groups with different origins, and which create in a small territory a new political system, which slowly then becomes a state society. So, as I say, settlements, economy, and funerary with all the interdisciplinary panoplia, which we can apply now, especially thanks to genetics. The story is becoming so much more detailed, because you can trace the biographies of the people. We have found, for example, the children of some of the people. We have found the parents. We know who migrated. That's very, very interesting in general.
Great. So can we delve into the evidence some more? What is the archaeology telling you now?
Okay. If we look at the funerary world, it's interesting that the grave goods allowed, that's a study from Vicente Lull and Jordi Esteves already in the 80s, through a statistical analysis, they managed to find out associations which show 5 social categories. A very small elite of male and women, defined with silver and gold and weapons. Then a middle class, which was category 3, which has axes and daggers, the male, and the woman. That's interesting. The women have daggers and awls.
What kind of awls?
What the meaning of these awls, these pins, these awls, probably is related with textile production. So this would be middle class women. And also in Central Europe, you have burials of female with knives, daggers, and the pin, better than pin, we should say awl, which has a wooden handle and a copper pin inside, and you can work textiles with that. So we think that the women are handling a particular part of the economy, mainly to do with textiles, while the male with axes and daggers are doing something different. I will talk now later of what they might be doing. And then you have 2 categories which have either only pots or one small copper tool, and then you have tombs which have nothing. That was discovered statistically, as I say, in the 80s. Then recently, some years ago, my colleague Harald Meller and Ralf Schwarz from the Museum of Halle, they did the same analysis with the burials of Aunjetitz of Central Europe. And surprisingly, they found the same 5 groups, very, very similar. So the political structure at the height of both societies, in the funerary record at least, looks very, very similar. Moreover, in Central Europe, they have something we do not have in Southeast Spain, which is hoards. In Iberia, El Argar, they didn't do hoarding. They didn't have the necessity to store copper objects in the ground and forget about them. Whereas this is a very typical practice in Germany. Usually, we thought that these burials with a lot of axes, some have 300 axes, 150 axes, halberds, so with weapons, that these were gifts to the gods. This was the common interpretation. Harald Meller now has proposed something. He looked at the numbers and he saw, oh, this is interesting. We have hoards about 15 axes and one halberd. We have hoards about 30 axes, 90 axes, 150 axes. He saw that there was a sort of metrical system in the hoards, and that the proportion between axes and halberds, there was a lot of axes and very few halberds, the same as in El Argar. And he said, maybe the axes, which are chemically all the same and all have use-wear traces, are weapons produced in charges, in sequence, in series, probably in Austria, in southern Germany, or in Austria, in the Alps, where the metal, we know the metal comes from the Alps, and then they are distributed to Central Europe through the elites, and the elite gives these axes to their armies. And when the chief or the dominant person dies, maybe they took all the weapons and stored them. They found them in special houses now, and the new ruler distributes new weapons, a new charge asks for new weapons from the Alps to come. This is a hypothesis, a working hypothesis now, and we have to check, but it's really surprising that they chemically are all the same.
So can you just explain the relationship between those weapons and the social elements of society?
The archaeology of the social distinction, the socially distinctive elements are, as I say, the top class is halberds and then it's swords. There is a shift. The halberd is used in both areas until 1800. And after 1800, 1700, the swords appear. They probably come from the Aegean, the idea of the sword. The high class women in Southeast Iberia have these silver diadems, which are these fantastic objects which are probably produced all in the same workshop. They are so incredibly similar that they probably come all from one workshop. And then you have the pottery. That's also interesting. These societies in the Bronze Age, Aunjetitz and Alargar, have a very distinctive, undecorated pottery. And they produce over centuries always the same shapes. The main bowl is the carinated form. The carinated bowl exists in Aunjetitz and it exists in Southeast Iberia and El Argar. And surprisingly, another common trait. And this seems to be the specific vessel for drinking and eating, sharing food. As we are drinking now our tea, we all have the same mugs in Barcelona and in Australia. So that was the same thing, that people were looking at the world and food through the same pots. And I think this is a very important ideological element.
The narrative and interpretations have changed hugely through this decade of research. What are the key things that you can say now about these people that you couldn't say before?
Well, what we can say now is, on one side, in La Almoloya, we have evidence of a palatial architecture. I think that is very important. And the settlement of La Bastida, which can be visited by tourists with also La Almoloya now, it has been restored. Everything we have excavated has been restored and you can visit it. It shows you a city. It shows you the first city in continental Europe where you can walk through the narrow streets, you can visit the workshops, and you get a feeling of how the life, how difficult it was. La Bastida, you must imagine, is not a settlement in the plains, easily accessible like a Roman town. No, it's high up in the mountains, very well protected, with sharp mountains. You hardly can see the place when you are in the valley. It's a hidden city. And all the resources were transported. For example, the meat, all the animal products. We have done isotopic analysis. nitrogen and carbon isotopic analysis. This was published last year. And we saw that the cows, the cattle, was maintained in the lowlands on the fields, on the barley fields, because the barley showed such a high nitrogen value that it could only have been explained with manuring. This is at least 5 kilometers away from the city. I mean, this is a huge difference that you have in the mountains, the city, and you have your food resources, both the barley and the cows who are then grazing the fields. They are at least 5 kilometers away from you. So you're totally dependent on a society, on a farming society, which lives in the lowland. And the elites and the taxes are being stored in the mountains. It's, I think, a very significant geographical criteria to say there is an excess of workforce, which wouldn't be necessary, for example, in Roman times. Why did they this? Who were they hiding from? We didn't understand. Why are they in the mountains? The easy answer was, oh, it's all violence. But we didn't have these evidence for large-scale violence, burning down of these cities and so on. Now we understand it's much more a social thing. The elite is living in the high mountains. Especially there is also not so hot in the summer, where Southeast Iberia is extremely arid and hot. And the fields are in the lowlands where the water is and where you can keep the animals along the rivers also. So this is one thing. We have got a better insight about the spatial relations. And the other thing, of course, is kinship, the DNA. We now understand both in El Argar and in Central Europe that these societies, well, we all know processual archaeology. Processual archaeology was thinking that everything mainly are local processes. Suddenly, thanks to paleogenetics, the variable of population movement can be tackled with archaeology. Formerly, it was all speculations. I mean, in times of Gordon Child or Maria Gimbutas, we speculated. Oh, this spot looks similar to this, so maybe they were communicating or they were traveling, but we never knew. Now we know people were traveling sometimes, not always, sometimes, and to some places. And I think this enriches the picture because suddenly we have a new variable to say what importance had migration, but also integration. I think as important as to talk about migration is to talk, well, the people who moved, were they integrated then in the society? How did this work? These are problems of our own society. And what we see is that the whole time there has been integration of new groups and apparently without violence. So maybe we can learn something from this. And I think this is another story, another part of this narrative, which I think is very, very fascinating and which can, open our eyes to a completely different panorama.
Yeah, that's what I want to ask you more about. Where does your team's research go from here? What are the new questions you want to ask in the future?
Well, definitely one thing is we need to do much more use-where analysis on the tools to understand their economic meaning, especially the stone tools, which in the Bronze Age have been neglected, as I said before. We need to find out more the biographies of the tools. What work process were they in? This is one big area. The other one is kinship. I have talked about migration, but the other big issue is kinship relation. We need to understand, for example, aspects like female or male exogamy. Are the daughters or the sons moving to the other settlements? Then we want to know, is it a monogamic society or is there polygamy or polygyny? We want to understand how the family, the kinship structures, was it extended families? Was it nuclear families? I have the feeling we are dealing with extended families because of the size of the houses, the number of tombs. So these are questions to understand how does political structures and kinship structures, how are they working? A little bit in the sense of the old book of Friedrich Engels, The Origins of the Family and the Private Property and the State. I mean, these are still the big questions, how does the state change our kinship relations? This, I think, is one question we need to tackle in the future. But finally, the one issue which we don't have the answers is the end of these societies. why are so many state societies with these unequal social relations and taxing systems and surplus extraction, why many of them end dramatically? Why do they collapse after relatively few centuries? I mean, in El Argar, the state with all its complexity may have lasted for 150, 200 years, and in Augnetitz, maybe it was 300, but not more. And it collapsed suddenly around 1550 BC, and the societies which followed, clearly there was no migration, they are the same society, but they abandoned totally these burial rituals which mark the hierarchy. They abandoned the settlements, they destroyed the settlements, they destroyed the palace of Almoloya, it was burned down, and they started a much more mobile, a much more, let's say, Neolithic way of living, until the Greeks and the Romans came to Iberia, or in the late Iron Age in central Germany. So we have much more egalitarian structures for the next thousands of years, until we have the next attempt to form a new state, which basically was the Greek and Phoenicians.
So talking about the Bronze Age collapse in El Argar and Unetitza, Germany, how would you characterize that at the moment?
In the end of El Argar, we see increasing child mortality, exhaustion of resources, more and more arid conditions due to over-exploiting of the cereal field. They were deforesting all the valleys, not the mountain, but the valleys, to extend their fields. And we see that the grain size is decreasing. So we see that the grain is having more and more difficulties to grow. So people basically seem to be starving. We have evidence of anemia in the bones. And so the nutrition is worsening. For example, in the beginning, you have a balance between legumes, pulses, beans and lentils, and cereal. And in the last decades, you have more and more, they were practically only eating barley as the main food and nutritional resource. And then you have the burning. And after this collapses, the pottery continues the same, the bone tools, the metal tools continue, everything continues the same, but not the burial ritual, which is the way these societies had to express their differences between rich and poor, between male and female. This disappears totally, both in Germany and in Southeast Spain. But our explanation to this is there was a social revolution. There was a social uprising which destroyed, just because it was unsustainable. That degree of asymmetry, of social asymmetry, was unsustainable. And again, here we have an example which should make us think about ourselves, you know, in a society today, in the 2021, where 1% of the Earth's population owns nearly 50% of the wealth. Something is wrong. And El Argar and Augnetitz might tell us, look, these systems in the end don't work, because most of the population at some point will not collaborate anymore with this.
Thank you very much for joining me, Roberto Risch. La Bastida's website is la-bastida.com. My next guest is Professor Jan Driessen of the Universitat Catholique de Louvain and the CC Archaeological Project. Jan's antiquity paper, Revisiting the Minoan Palaces, reports on a decade of fieldwork at CC on Crete and some remarkable new insights into the ceremonial and ritual life of Minoan society. So welcome, Jan. What did you know about the Minoan settlements when you started back then, and what did you set out to achieve?
The excavations at CC were actually like a big surprise, because when we started this project in 2007, we actually didn't realize what was hidden there. Our main aim was a better understanding of the relationship between a small secondary site in the territory of Malia. And Malia is just 3 kilometers away to the west. And Malia was a huge site during the Middle Bronze Age, and even a large site during the earlier and later Bronze Age. And so CC, at a maximum extent of 3 hectares, was just a subsidiary site within its territory. And so gradually, the excavations over 10 seasons revealed certain remains, which actually made us question this relationship between a major center and a secondary settlement. And first of all, we found like a huge Mycenaean building with about 30 different rooms. That also was much more elaborate and much more important than the remains that had been found at Malia. Sort of Mycenaean period is about the 15th, 14th, 13th century BC. And then, to our big surprise, in 2011, we found the first evidence of the presence of a monumental complex, possibly with a central court. And we stopped. We invited a geophysical team from the University of Rotterdam with Apostolos Saris. And his team actually found evidence for the presence of a very large court, more than 30 meters long, on the southeast top of the CC hill. And when we started excavations again in 2015, progressively, gradually, this became a very large complex, about 2,000 square meters. And if you realize that this court building is only 3 kilometers from Malia, it made us question what we were actually finding there. How is it possible that only 3 kilometers from such a major palatial town, there is another small settlement, 3 hectares, with a monumental complex? And so this led to eventually to this paper in Antiquity magazine, where I tried to consider the different angles of this research, both the planning angle of the building and how it actually looked like in the field, and how to explain its possible presence on the site. I'm not saying that this is the definite answer to the question, but I hope it helped actually to a better understanding and also a better nuancing of the function of these court buildings, how I prefer to call them, rather than palaces on known Crete. Because this palace question, what is the function of this court complex on Crete, is something which has been bugging us for the last 30 years. And the earlier times, starting with Arthur Evans, the main excavator, it's always been related to some kind of royalties, like an individual power that was based in these buildings. Progressively, especially since the new archaeology started in the 80s, especially where Crete is concerned, a lot of different explanations have been proposed. And so this is probably just one of the possible explanations that next generation may find different kinds of evidence.
So was it the functional characteristics of these court complexes that you were going for? Or were you looking to understand the social aspects as well?
Well, I mean, all these questions, I think, are interrelated. I think we need to understand the function of these buildings, and that will probably also inform us on the society which constructed these. The evidence of the Sisi building is concerned. I mean, you have to realize that several of these palaces were excavated in the early years of archaeology. Knossos, 1900, 1908, basically. Festos, almost the same period. Malia started excavation just after the First War and continued in the 20s. And then the first palace, which was really preserved in its entirety almost, with lots of finds in it, because all the other ones had been robbed or pillaged or abandoned before the destruction, was the Palace of Zakros, which was excavated in the 60s. But that's still not entirely published. I mean, there's very good preliminary publications, but we're still waiting for the final publication. And again, the Palace of Zakros was the first one, and henceforth the only one, which was actually preserved with all its finds in it. Again, at Sisi, our building was robbed or abandoned and people took the stuff with them. So we're actually deprived of some kind of information to understand the function of the individual rooms. But still, sometimes the room types or the finds that are left behind actually give us some information about the function of the different areas.
So what did you find?
And so our 2 main deposits that we did find in the CC court building were actually very large pottery deposits, okay? And almost identical types of pottery, drinking cups, drinking vases. And so we had one smaller deposit with about 150 of these vases buried in a bench, carefully buried in a bench with a rhyton. Okay? That's of a slightly earlier phase than a final deposit, which was actually probably constructed in a cyclical way, so like an episodical way, that they dumped a number of cups, plastered them over, and then dumped another layer of cups. And so we have 3, 4, 5 layers. And so we assume that each of these layers actually corresponds to a special event in which these cups were used. They are partly contemporary to the other deposit of 150 cups, but partly also later.
How do you make sense of these layers?
So Our hypothesis is that the first deposit, which was hidden in a bench, was actually related to constructional deposit. So that was like when they reconstructed the building after what seems to have been an earthquake, workers came in from the site, because we can actually identify different groups in this pottery deposits, like 8, 9 different types of cups are represented. And so these groups probably collaborated to reconstruct the building, and they had some drinking party to celebrate this event. And this is actually something which we actually see in several other sites. And there's been very good work by Ilaria Caloi, for instance, at the site of Festos, who's also been showing these like constructional deposits that celebrate the event of the construction itself. The other main deposit in the court complex of Sisi seems to be something like maybe an annual event that took place. We cannot say when it took place or at what interval it took place, but it seems to involve a larger number of people. Now we are almost at 3,000 cups. And if you say if you can divide that by 4 or 5 different events, then you have about 400 people that took part in these events. And our central court is big enough to have like 300 people standing or walking around there. Not saying that they all were there at the same time, but it seems to be something, the central court seems to be something that has been made just to receive people from the site itself and maybe also from the farmsteads in the immediate area. The court is like accessible via 2, probably 4 direct entrances. So you arrive there at the outside and there's passageways, paved passageways, which lead into the building and straight to the court. We don't know where these visitors were entertained, where there's benches, wooden benches or something like that, but there's certainly room for a lot of people within the complex. And surprisingly, the architecture around it, once you get into the wings around the court, that is really small. I mean, there's like tiny rooms. There's barely a room which can receive more than 15 people or something like that. So the heart of the structure is the central court.
Was that just in the last phase of the building?
Well, our building, the latest phase, which is preserved and which was actually abandoned around the time of the Santorini eruption, is sort of like a 16th century. But it actually reuses and incorporates the remains of a larger structure, which is 1,000 years earlier. And so it's from a phase that we call early Minoan II, and it's probably early Minoan IIb, so the later phase of the early Minoan II period, during which also the same location actually housed a monumental building, at least a monumental terrace with lots of rooms to the west of it. And so when there's a hiatus between 2,500 and let's say 1650. So there's like almost 1,000 years of hiatus before they reused this area, because at the time that Malia was very important, the Middle Bronze Age, there is evidence on our side, it was used as a secondary settlement. There's no evidence for a major building yet. You never know in archaeology, of course, but it seems to be that during this phase that Malia was extremely important, that Sisi wasn't. But once Malia actually suffered from this very large destruction around 1750, Sisi seems to have found like a new energy or something, a new dynamics. And you gradually see larger buildings, more houses being constructed, houses with frescoes, for instance, and quite nice material culture. And then they also reconstructed this monumental complex and enlarged it gradually also. The presence of this early Bronze Age complex seems to have attracted the construction of this new complex. And so we were actually wondering if it was this presence of this earlier building which actually gave it much more social power, because the early monumental wall remained visible. Actually, they incorporated the destruction levels as they were within their new building. And so it's extremely funny, when we were digging, you were actually digging a room of the 16th century BC, and then suddenly you were 1,000 years earlier. And they just left pots actually sitting in their same rooms. It's usually beneath staircases, for instance, where they just simply left evidence and all the early remains. I don't know if it was intentional, but it is really quite surprising for an archaeologist to suddenly like jump 1,000 years within the same context almost. So,
how did it relate to these much earlier buildings?
They seem to really have reused this building within their later power structure, if you want. We actually see the same thing happening in Festos, Knossos, and Malia. One of the most surprising walls at Knossos, for instance, is the northwest terrace wall. And that is actually on the same alignment as the later palace. They really incorporated that in their later construction, and it's the same orientation. At Sisi, it's more or less the same orientation. They started off with the same orientation, but then the court went a little bit oblique, more to the west and to the east as we expected. So that's why during the first year of excavation, we thought, my God, what's happening here? This is not a rectangular straight court. It's like going the wrong way. So it's trapezoidal almost. But we explained this actually through the gradual enlargement of the court.
You said at the beginning that our understanding of Minoan social life was still derived from Arthur Evans. So what's changed for you now? What's the new interpretation?
Well, the odd thing is, as you mentioned, we have evidence for ceremonies. And I also think we have evidence for several ritual events or maybe religious things like sacrifices and things like that. So possible horns of consecration. We have a circular structure, a burnt structure in the middle of the court, which seems to be in some kind of an altar, if you want, because just next to it, we found a deposit of miniature cups, like which originally would have formed one single vase, which we call a kernos. And there's also a very special room on the court, which is at the same position as the throne room at Knossos or the loggia at Malia. So sufficient evidence, I think, to argue for a ceremonial and a religious function, at least of the court-related area. There's this almost a platitude now that Minoan palaces are like a combination of whatever Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and Westminster, a combination of different functions. In the Minoan terms, it would be evidence for administration, evidence for production, for storage, and then for politics, for ritual, ceremony, and things like that, religion. But we don't have evidence for administration, for instance, okay? We have very few burnt destruction deposits within the court center of Sisi, and you need a burnt destruction, evidently, to preserve clay tablets or clay documents. If you don't have that, you have to be lucky to preserve these things. We do have a few burnt destructions, but there's no evidence in these of administrative documents. The second thing is production. In the major palaces, like at Knossos, Malia, Festos, and Zakros, you have pretty good evidence for the production of valuable materials, like stone vase production or metal production or pottery production. So things that may have served possibly in the ceremonies that were taking place within this building, or maybe as gifts or something, like there's like a production aspect, a production function related to these buildings. And that we don't have at all. We have evidence for obsidian production, but that dates to the early Bronze Age. And then the third element, which is probably the most surprising and also need explanation in terms of the communal ceremonies that we've indicated that took place in the building, that is storage. The archetypal images of the Palace of Knossos or Malia, to a lesser extent, Zakros and Festos, are these batteries, these galleries of magazines, storage magazines that occupy the west wing of these buildings, which were filled with large pithoi, sometimes 2 meters or even bigger. A calculation by Kostas Christakis of those in the west wing of the Palace of Knossos comes around to about more than 500 of these storage jars, which were standing there in a slightly later period, but still the architecture is Minoan, let's say, and also in the Palace of Malia, there was more than enough storage space. And so you have these typical long rooms, which were really invented to be storage rooms. And there's none of these in the court center at Sisi. And so storage is something which we entirely lack. And so even pithoi, there's a shirt of pithos, maybe an earlier shirt even, lying around, but there's no evidence for pithoi either, these huge storage jars. So storage is something which is entirely lacking. And so if you assume, well, I was talking about these communal ceremonies that took place in the central court and with all the cups being deposited. And if you drink, evidently you need some kind of a container in which the wine, for instance, arrived. And so we don't have evidence for these original containers within the building, which means that they must have brought certain things with them from the surrounding houses.
So what does that mean for Sisi's relationship with the other court centres around Crete?
It is a difficult question because, okay, we're only 3 kilometers from Malia. So Malia, big site, must have had so much importance that it was also probably hierarchically in charge of Sisi. To that extent, you may also have had Sissiots that played a role in the political decisions at Malia. So that cannot be excluded, of course. And our pottery specialists, for instance, Ira Makiudaku and Charlotte Langoor, have identified like evidence for Cnossian ways of making pottery and decorating pottery and shapes that show up from the late Middle Bronze Age and the early Late Bronze Age. And so gradually we see this more Cnossian influence taking at least a place where pottery production and consumption is concerned. And also the ubiquitous conical cup, which is the drinking cup of the early Late Bronze Age, is like omnipresent. And that's a Cnossian invention, most people think. On the other hand, ashlar construction, the walls facing the central court in the Sisi building are in ashlar. And also Modevolder has argued, or an architectural specialist has argued, that this is also maybe a Cnossian thing. Okay? So that gradually Cnossian masons may have been involved in the construction or reconstruction of certain buildings. If that is sufficient as evidence, then you could argue that Knossos was actually progressively in some kind of an imperialist tendency, occupying or putting people in place in these different areas, or just having its influence being felt locally and imposing certain rituals or ceremonies that actually served the Cnossian ideology. And so these massive consumption ceremonies in which the community actually took part in some kind of drinking, feasting. Maybe this all served this ideology, which at least during the pre-Santorini eruption phase seems to have been focused on a great goddess, sort of, which is actually evidenced through iconography. You know, we cannot show her presence, for instance, at Sisi, but in sites where you have iconographical documents preserved, you actually see that this great goddess was actually very much present. In Mochlos, for instance, they had this marvelous ivory box in which this goddess is shown and frescoes from different areas and so on.
What's next for Sisi in this research?
We have this responsibility for the site, and so our main concern is now to consolidate the remains and to gradually make it open for the public. The interesting thing is, of course, at Sisi we have a cemetery, which is very close to the seaside, and then we have good evidence for almost every phase. So it is, in a miniature case, you actually see the entire Minoan civilization on a single site. And since Sisi is also very touristy, I'm sure that people will appreciate this. We hope to start a new cycle of excavations in another 5 years, but only for small-scale investigations. There's some things that we need to finish. Okay, so I didn't talk about the other phases at Sisi, where we have also funerary buildings which need a little bit more exploration, and phases after the Santorini eruption or during the early Mycenaean phase. We found a very nice example during the last season of a lady with a gold necklace, for instance, which belongs to this early Mycenaean occupation of the island. We also hope to do some more tests within the court building just to define its chronology much better. Our present idea is that the building was enlarged progressively, where we need to back this up by tests and to actually show that this is the case. Because the architecture is a bit weird and it shows like different angles and different orientations, but we would prefer to actually have some serious ceramic evidence at least to back up this hypothesis. Also, the pre-palatial building, or buildings rather, that existed at the site of the later court complex need some more investigation.
What about those big questions about the rise of the state and, the Bronze Age collapse?
Whatever you do is actually always related to these major questions. Because, for instance, the pre-palatial village that we're trying to find out is just before the construction of this monumental building in early Minoan 2B. And so we need to understand how this like quantum leap actually happened. We seem to have like a small village in early Minoan 2A, and suddenly in early Minoan 2B, the quality of the pottery changes. Suddenly you find gold in the remains, and you have this monumental architecture starting. So this is like the origin of the state, possibly, but at least locally. And also our site was suddenly abandoned in the 13th century. And this is, of course, the main period of site abandonments, settlement abandonments on the island. It's about a generation earlier than the collapse of the Mycenaean palaces on the mainland. But it's all related to this big discussion, which Rick Klein wrote his now famous book, 1177, the year of civilization collapses. But it's all related, because this is also why we actually now also have a project on Cyprus, Pila Kokinokremos, where we have an early 12th century settlement, which was suddenly abandoned after just one phase of occupation. And so the funny thing was that the first vase our team found at Pila on Cyprus was almost identical to the last vase we found at Sisi, just the same shape and the same decoration. So just a little bit more crude in its decoration. But so the story continues. And in our area, actually, you see the mountain behind my head on the center, that's the Anavlogos. And that's where actually my wife's excavating another site, which was occupied immediately after our site was abandoned. She's working for the French school, but it's actually interesting that our story continues within the same area.
Thank you very much for talking to me today, Jan Driessen. All the papers we've talked about today are detailed on the website. So that brings us to the end of this episode of Foreign Countries. Join me next time for another conversation.